Can we talk about strategy a little bit? I want to just cap strategy and the end of 2025 and just have thoughts on that. Their stock is down, I think, below NAV at this point. I haven't looked like today, but as of a couple days ago, it was below NAV. What happens? Well, I want to play out two scenarios. The first scenario is strategy fails, meaning the stock goes down so much, people sell, and then the stock basically collapses in on itself. What signal would that send to the rest of the institutional world or for-profit, like Fortune 500 company that is just wants to hold Bitcoin in the balance sheet?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things there. First, I believe the stock's market cap is below the value of their Bitcoin holdings, but if you subtract the debt that a strategy has, that's their true NAV, is the assets minus the debt, and that their stock is still above that value slightly. And so it's not so bad. That being said, effectively these treasuries and strategy, they're like a closed-end fund where you can buy shares, but you can't redeem directly. You can only trade on a secondary market. A lot of closed-end funds trade at a discount to NAV because you're basically buying an asset plus expenses of the business to run that asset. And so it's not unusual for something to trade below NAV. And sometimes even when something's trading below NAV, it still makes sense to sell shares to buy more of the asset, depending on the unit economics of that business. That being said, strategy is uniquely positioned in that because of the scale of strategy and the liquidity of their stock and the options market around their stock, they can create these various, the STRD, STRC, STRK, STRF, various kind of preferred shares, debt products that allow for you to stratify different layers of risk of the MicroStrategy product or the strategy product. And there's different buyers that are looking for those exact types of risk. And so just like, if you sell 100 cartons of cigarettes, it's a wholesale price, but if you sell an individual pack or a single cigarette, you charge more. This like breaking it down into more defined risk layers, I think does create value, and it creates more access for certain kinds of investors. So maybe it does make sense for it to trade slightly above NAV, but otherwise, it's just Bitcoin with expenses. I think the other issue that strategy has is they've been so resolutely saying we will never sell Bitcoin. And that was when they were trading at 2.5x their NAV, right? And so things have changed. And I think they're probably getting pressure from things like the S&P 500 Index Inclusion Board, institutional investors, and internally of, okay, what are you going to do now? And so they've said, maybe we'll lend the Bitcoin. Maybe we'll do option strategies. Maybe we would sell Bitcoin if we drop below NAV. And I feel like they've really painted themselves in a corner where they've said, we'll never do any of this. And then now they're kind of this shifting, wavering policy of what they'll do. And it kind of highlights why people like Bitcoin, because Bitcoin doesn't change. Strategy is in some ways almost the opposite of Bitcoin. Its policy changes. It's run by a charismatic leader who, if he dies, the stock, would collapse, or, if something happens to him, he could say one weird thing or have a lawsuit against him, and there'd be major problems where there's no lawsuit against Satoshi Nakamoto possible. And so there's advantages to a public company and a non-Bitcoin in that there's marketing, there's adaptive behavior to what the market does that maybe will make the thing perform better than Bitcoin at times. But I think also the last thing to highlight is even if strategy does do lending or options yield strategies, which is what our firm does, there's not enough liquidity in the world to service $60 billion of Bitcoin in these strategies right now. So I don't think this is like a real way out for them to produce income, because it's just a tiny dent in their real size to even do any of these things, or the whole market will get just crushed. The rates will get crushed. And so I think they're really in a tough spot. And then lastly, they have all this competition now, all these other treasuries. We just saw XXI or 21 Capital, backed by SoftBank and Tether, it starts trading tomorrow or today when you're viewing this. And these groups from the start have said, we're going to trade, we're going to lend, we're going to create a financial operations business. And so they're not painted into that same corner, and they're really smart people that know what they're doing. And so I think that strategy, just by the size of its size, it has momentum like a giant battleship, but changing directions and navigating these kind of fraught waters might be challenging in the weeks and months to come.